Okay, welcome back to Judgment and Decision Making Part 2. So last time we talked about the Yale Communication Project. We talked about the basic ideas of who, what, and to whom, right? So the source characteristic, that's who. The what, that's the message characteristics. To whom, that's the receiver characteristics, right? And the importance of each of those. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the cognitive processes underlying persuasion, right? So the things that are most, what's really going on in your brain when you're persuaded by something, persuaded by a message. To do this, we need to talk about some different kinds of theories. The big ones are called the Elaboration Likelihood Model, or the ELM, by Petty and Cacioppo in 1986, and the Heuristic Systems Model by Chaikin in 1987. Now, these are the two dual process models. These are the two big models of how we are persuaded by an argument. All right? ELM and HSM. That's the ones we're talking about. Now, they're very similar. They're very similar. And I'll tell you a way to distinguish the two, which is pretty similar. But for the most part, we're going to talk about them kind of combined. And then I'll tell you how we distinguish them from each other. All right. So both of these are called dual process models. And what they're trying to do is to specify when people are going to be persuaded by a message, meaning the quality of the actual message, versus the other stuff around the message, like the attractiveness of the person saying it, or how long it is, or whatever it happens to be. That just the peripheral stuff that has nothing to do with the actual content of the message. Now, the ELM and the HSM are telling us that we're going to either process the actual content of the message or the other stuff, depending on your motivation and your cognitive resources. So follow me on this one. So what we're saying is, hey, at different times, you might be motivated to actually listen to and look through the actual content of the message to figure out if you're persuaded by it. But at other times, there's other things like how attractive the source is, or how long you have to wait to listen to the thing, which says, oh, I think that's persuasive. I'm going to believe it. Okay? That's what we're discussing. And it depends on the cognitive resources and motivations that the person, the receiver, has. If the issue is relevant, if the source is knowledgeable in their domain, if you are personally responsible for the outcome of things, then you're going to be more motivated to make a good choice, to listen, and have more motivation to make a good decision. However, and also the cognitive resources include things like just being tired, right? How long the message is, other things that would cause cognitive load. What else? Other stuff that's being bombarding your attention, that kind of stuff. So motivation, how motivated you are to actually make a good decision. Cognitive resources, what are the resources that you have available to you? So what we're going to do is we're going to watch this video, which is a clip from The Simpsons. Okay, in that video, you saw that Bart was trying to persuade people to vote for him, right? Now, when we're talking about the elaboration likelihood model, the central route is the route that talks about the actual content of the message. The peripheral route is the other stuff around it, not the actual content of the message. So I want you to think about when Bart was saying more asbestos, was he trying to persuade using peripheral or central processing? That would be an example of peripheral processing, because the actual content of the message is we need more asbestos, right? If somebody is really motivated to understand what's happening here and whether we should make a good decision about who should be the class president based off of this issue of asbestos, then the actual message is more asbestos. That's the message. How he said it and the charisma and his attractiveness and all that other stuff, that is peripheral to it. It's not central to the argument. So here's what we're going to do. Let's talk about the central route. In the ELM, we call this a central route. In the HSM, the heuristic systematic model, we call it the systematic route. And what this is saying is that when we call this a dual process model, the two processes are the central and the peripheral, right? That's for the ELM. It's systematic or heuristic for the HSM. Okay? So what we're saying is that when you are given a persuasive argument, there are actually literally two processes. So think about like literally two separate processes going on in your brain. This persuasion will go through the central route, which is how you process things by evaluating the argument, or the peripheral route, which means that you just evaluate the attractiveness, the excitement, the whatever, the length of the argument, the humor, that kind of stuff. Notice, and so when they say dual process, they're talking about in your brain, you're the receiver of the message. There are two different processes that this argument can go through. The central process is, the central route is when you think rationally about the actual content of the message. Now, in Bart's example, the message was more asbestos. So if you're processing this in the central or the systematic route, then you are saying, oh, well, you know, he is advocating for more asbestos in the school. And then you would process that and say, oh, based off of the actual content, whether or not I feel persuaded. The peripheral route, or the heuristic route for the HSM, is when you're getting all that the superficial stuff, okay? How attractive, whether the person seems like an expert, whether whether they're humorous, whether it's exciting, those kind of things. In Bart's case, it's clearly peripheral, right? The actual message is really bad for him, but he's very persuasive, not because of the centrality of the message, but because of the periphery, right? Because of his charisma, his attractiveness, his humor, etc. Now, these dual process theories are going to say, so just make sure we're totally clear about that. The two processes are the central route or the peripheral route when we're talking about the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model. Those are almost exactly the same as the systematic route, that's like the central route, and the heuristic route, that's like the peripheral route, under the HSM. Okay, so we will process information centrally using the central route or the systematic route when that is, when we have personal involvement, okay? When we have a need for cognition and low cognitive load. So, what we're talking about here, when we have personal involvement, discrepancy, forewarning, and fear, these are things that can influence whether or not we're really going to process these things in the central route. So discrepancy means that when we look at, you're going to be analyzing the actual message. If there's discrepancy in the message, then that can be problematic because the central route is going to look for that. It's going to analyze it. Forewarning is an interesting process. There's some forms of communication where you can actually forewarn the person receiving it of the opposite of your point of view. And by doing that, you can undermine any counter attacks, right? So the way you would do this is, let's say that I'm Martin and I'm trying to persuade you in the central processing route, you actually care about the amount of asbestos because, you know, it can cause cancer, right? And so I'm talking to you about how asbestos causes cancer, et cetera. The forewarning might be, hey, some people might tell you that we should ignore the threat of asbestos because the cost of removing asbestos is extremely expensive. Well, let me tell you about that. So the forewarning is saying that, hey, we can overcome this. I'm giving you the counter argument. Normally I make it a little bit weaker than they would, and I give you the counter argument. It forewarns you so that if somebody else gives you another argument, you can say, oh yeah, but I remember Martin told me that you were going to say this, and I don't believe it. A fear appeal is something we're going to talk about later on. Fear is actually quite effective. If the person really, really cares about this, there could be quite a bit of fear going on. But fear appeals are not effective if you're terrified, right? They're effective if they're moderate. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. The central route will be processed if you also have a need for cognition, meaning you need to make sure that you have a desire to come to closure, right? Come to a conclusion, right? You have a need to understand what's going on and all the factors that are involved. That's the need for cognition. And you have to not be under cognitive load. You have to have enough cognitive resources to actually process the actual content. So most of what we've been talking about, like from the Yale Communication Lab, a lot of that's going to be kind of ideas of central route, right? Here's how I'm going to persuade you, etc. But a lot of what we talk about in advertising nowadays is actually peripheral route. The peripheral route is going to say that you're going to process the information based off of the source cues, right? So maybe the source cues are how credible the person seems to be or attractive. So these are when you see a commercial, for example, and the person is wearing a lab coat. They may not even say that they're a doctor, right? But if there's an attractive person wearing a lab coat, you're like, well, that person seems credible and attractive. Oh, what do they say? Oh, I kind of like Advil, that kind of a thing. The message cues include things that you don't even think about. So, for example, what they have done is they've shown that you can give people two different written arguments. One argument is just a couple sentences, and the other argument is a couple of pages or a few paragraphs long. And you ask them which one they like better. In reality, the actual quality of the argument is the same. It's really not giving you more information in either way. It's just longer. People think that the longer message is more persuasive, even though the actual content of what is being argued is less. How can the content be less, you're saying? Well, what I'm saying is if people are using extra filler words or flowery words or just sentence structures, we're talking about just physical length of the argument is a cue that it is more persuasive. In reality, that has nothing to do with the actual quality of the argument. It's just longer, right? But people associate it with a higher quality, more persuasive argument. Mood, so the mood that it puts you in, whether you're in a happy mood, a sad mood, etc., that can influence whether you're persuaded. And the idea of consensus, if you're just like, oh, well, everybody is doing it, then I'm going to do it too. These are all peripheral to the actual argument itself. Now, what we're saying here is that the central route requires you to do more work. So I've got the little, steps here. If you're actually attending to the message through the central or systematic route, then you got to climb up these stairs and it's effortful and or you can just go the fast route, which is the peripheral route or the heuristic route, and just take the cues and let those be the factors that persuade you, right? The reason why people are persuaded by peripheral routes or heuristic routes is because it's easier. And often they are less motivated to process that information of the actual content. If it's something that you really care about and you want to know the real answer because it's going to affect you very personally, then you'll go through the central, also called the systematic route. So let's take a look at this. Here's a diagram of how this would work. You hear this persuasive message. If you're highly motivated or you have high cognitive capacity, then you're going to process this on a different route than if you had low capacity or low motivation. So let's say that the persuasive message is about whether you should vote to let this business establish their business like literally in your backyard, like right behind your house. Okay, you're highly motivated because you want to know whether or not that's going to affect your property values, whether or not they're going to be loud, and so you're highly motivated, and you spend the cognitive resources to figure out what the right answer should or shouldn't be. When you do this, you're using the central route, if we're talking about the ELM, or the systematic route, if we're talking about the HSM. This route is going to lead you to have an attitude change depending on the strength of the argument and the actual message itself. So how good is the actual content of the message? Conversely, if you have an unimportant message or low cognitive capacity, right? So you're just watching TV and suddenly here's a headache medicine commercial and you don't even have a headache, right? It's not very important to you. You don't have very much capacity. Then you're going to process this through a peripheral route, according to the ELM, or heuristic route, according to the HSM, which is you're just going to tend to whether or not whether or not the person is attractive or whether or not you think it's, it seems pretty good. The heuristic stuff, not the actual message itself, attractiveness, authority, these kind of things, which aren't the actual content of the message, they are peripheral to it. Or, like it entails, heuristics are shortcuts in decision making, a heuristic for making your decision. Now, what's the difference between these two? I've talked about the ELM and the HSM as if they were exactly the same. They're pretty similar. Pretty similar. So the central route and the systematic route, pretty close to the same thing. Peripheral route and heuristic route, pretty close to the same thing. The difference is that the ELM thinks that you're either going to process this persuasive message, either the central route or the peripheral route. You can't do both. The HSM says you have two separate routes, but you actually can process them simultaneously, right? So some of the information from the message can be processed simultaneously with things like the attractiveness of the person saying it, that kind of stuff. Okay, so the main difference you need to know, ELM, it's one or the other. HSM, it can be both at the same time with different amounts of influence. So I want to ask you, we're going to do an example of this, but first I want to ask you, how would you feel if your university had comprehensive exams? So what that means is that when you get to be a senior, you're about to graduate, you have to pass a final that has to do with everything that you learned about your major, right? So if you're a psychology major, it's not just about your one class that you're in, it's about all your psychology classes, and you have to pass this comprehensive exam. How do you feel about that? Well, this is an example of an argument that was given in an experiment by Petty and Katsiopa in 1979. So here's what they did. The participants, who were all college students, they read a persuasive communication advocating for comprehensive exams. So everybody read read one of these persuasive arguments. Okay. Now, in some people read a strong argument, which had good reasons why, like the actual content was higher quality. And some people read weaker arguments. Oh, I think it would be nice. That not very good arguments. Some people had high involvement and some people had low involvement. By high involvement, here's what it means. You were reading this and it's going to say, all right, this is an argument that we should have comprehensive exams 2 years from now. So the people who were graduating next year would never have to take the comprehensive exam. They have low involvement. That makes sense? They don't have much involvement because they're not going to have to worry about it. But a sophomore would have to take the comprehensive exam. So if you're in your second year, you're like, ooh, boy, I would have to actually take this exam if they decide to do this. That's high involvement. So what you see here is the amount of persuasion of the different conditions. All right. So the blue, this is high involvement, meaning blue people are the ones who are going to have to take the exam. These are the sophomores. They're actually going to have to take this if it passes. Okay. A strong argument was more persuasive, and a low argument was a weak argument was even less persuasive. You see the difference between those two? But people under low involvement, it was a little bit persuasive with the stronger argument. The weaker argument was less persuasive, right? But look at the difference. The involvement was a huge factor. How involved they were is a huge factor as to how persuasive it was. This means that what they're arguing here is that the people in the high involvement condition would be going through the central route. They would be actually looking at the argument strength. And as you see, the strong arguments, those were much more persuasive. The weak arguments was much less persuasive because they're evaluating the actual content of the message. Whereas the strong weakness of the argument was not very important to the people who had low involvement. If it wouldn't affect them, they didn't really care. So what they're saying is that, hey, the people in blue, they're the ones who were processing the central route. The people in yellow, not as much. Not as much. More of a peripheral route. This is an example of an advertisement using which route? This is a central route advertisement for printers in this particular case. Why? Because it's giving all you the stats and what's important, giving you all the information about the printer. Compare that to this. This is a peripheral route ad. It doesn't have any real information about the actual quality of the printer, etc. That's not what's going on. It's just saying, oh, this is kind of ugly, so oh, I can trade it in, and that'd be good. Okay, this is just looking at the ugliness, the periphery, just whether or not it catches your eye, that kind of stuff. It is not actually giving you a persuasive argument. There is another model. So the ELM and the HSM are what we call dual process models, two processes. R.E. Kruglanski offered a rebuttal to this, calling for what he called the unimodel. Now, the unimodel says we don't actually have two separate processes. It's not like there's two different places in your brain that's processing two separate things, right? It's all being processed in one way. And each of the different factors are just, they're just ingredients in the soup of whether or not you're going to be persuaded by an argument. So, for example, subjective relevance just means how relevant is this topic to you, right? Subjectively, how relevant is it to you? Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to have a central route that's separate from a peripheral route. That's part of the soup of what leads you to believe or not believe this persuasive argument. Motivation to process, right? How motivated you are to actually process the information. The difficulty of processing the information, right? Whether or not you can actually read it or understand it, that kind of thing. Your ability to process has to do with your cognitive load and your capacity. How biased you are, so whether or not you are biased to not believe anything that goes against your particular point of view, or if you're more intentionally trying to find an answer. But other things like the processing sequence. So there's what we call the primacy effect. The first arguments tend to be more persuasive, and there's also a recency effect. The last arguments tend to be more persuasive. So whatever's presented first and last is more likely to be remembered. If it's something in the middle, it's less likely to be remembered than the beginning or the end. That's just the way that works. So what Kruglanski is saying is that the unimodel is that all of these are just ingredients to persuasion. There's not like two separate parts of your brain that do this, but all of these are important for understanding why somebody might be persuaded by something. Okay, let's move away from the models now into a different idea. When we look at persuasion, besides this idea of central peripheral route, we also need to talk about the idea of one versus two-sided arguments. So sometimes it's good when you give an argument to just give one side. Don't even acknowledge the opposite point of view. And sometimes it's important to show that there are two sides to this. Acknowledge that there's another side to it. So part of this depends on how much agreement your audience members have with you before you start, right? So if you are Donald Trump talking to a Republican National Convention, then you know that people are probably not actually trying to decide who they're going to vote for, right? Whereas somebody who's trying to make a good argument about what car to buy might be thinking about both sides. So it depends on the ability and the motivation of the people in your audience. Sometimes it can be effective to say, well, this is the other side of the argument, but here's what I would say to it. The primacy effect we talked about before, and that's just the idea that things at the beginning of an argument tend to be remembered. The recency effect is that things at the end of the argument tend to be remembered as well. They have undue influence compared to the other parts of the argument. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go ahead and watch this ad. It's kind of a long one. Go ahead and watch this ad. Now tell me, whether or not you would have been persuaded by that ad. That particular ad is what we call, that's a very famous ad. It's the Lyndon Johnson ad called the Daisy ad. And it used what we call a fear appeal. The fear in this case is that we're all going to die of nuclear war, right? Fear arousing communication can be really, really effective at persuading people if they follow certain guidelines. So that is a fear arousing communication, also called a fear appeal. It's when you try and communicate or when you try to persuade somebody based off of fear. This is another example of it, right? So these are, I think these are Canadian tobacco cigarette, whatever, containers, right? And they're required to put these notices right on the actual cigarettes. These are fear-inducing. These are fear appeals, right? And these are fear appeals. So, are they really going to change your attitude about smoking, for example? Well, it depends. These work best if it's a moderate amount of fear. If you go around saying, hey, if you don't vote for me, you are going to be blown up in a nuclear war, that tends to be pretty extreme. A fear-arousing communication is most effective if it's a moderate amount of fear, not like end of the world kind of amount of fear, okay? And in the actual ad, you need to be able to teach people how they can reduce their fear. Specifically, it's got to be clear that this is a good solution that will actually work to eliminate their fear. If they just associate your product or your position with a great big amount of fear, then it's not going to be very effective. Let's do another example. Go ahead and watch this ad. So, did that ad make you want to buy Pepsi? That ad was a very famous ad that came out that people hated. People just hated. Why? Because they feel like they're trying to be manipulated. Reactance theory is something you should know about. Reactance theory is the idea that if you feel like your freedom is being taken away, right? If people are just saying, oh, you have to drink Pepsi, you have to drink Pepsi. You're like, oh my goodness, I don't have to do anything. When people feel like their freedom is being infringed on, they actually go the opposite way. They react. So this reactance theory is what people often call reverse psychology. You make somebody feel like they can't do something, and they go the opposite way, right? So if you say, "Oh, look, you have to drink Pepsi," and you're like, "Oh my goodness, that was awful," you feel reactant. You're like, "Oh man, I'm going to show them. I'm going to hate Pepsi now because they made it feel like I'm not a good person if I don't do this. They're undermining it." Boy, that was just over the top. So reactance is when you feel like you're being manipulated, you feel like your control is being taken away, and you go opposite to it. That boy, I need to. There's reactance again. So this is the last thing we're going to talk about. Attitudes that resist change can also happen when you're inoculated. This is the forewarning that we talked about before. The inoculation hypothesis is that if you go in there and in your persuasion you talk about the opposite point of view, you give them a small version of the opposite point of view, and then give a good persuasive argument as to why they shouldn't listen to the opposite point of view, that it can be really, really effective when they're exposed to a new advertisement. They're like, oh, wait a minute, I already know that this isn't going to be good. So for example, inoculation hypothesis would be if I'm trying to persuade you to buy an electric car. And so I'm saying, hey, electric cars are good. They're good for the environment. They're really reliable, and they got good features and all that stuff. Some people might tell you that electric cars are way too expensive. Well, let me tell you why that's not true in the long run, because of blah, 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 right? And then later on, somebody comes to you and say, hey, you should buy this gas car because electric cars are way too expensive. And you're like, hey, well, I already know the answer to this one because they already told me that that's not a good enough argument. That's the inoculation hypothesis. So sometimes people resist persuasion techniques if they've been inoculated or if they feel a particular amount of reactance. All right, thanks everybody.